Brazil, 1966. Long before the internet transformed every mystery into endless online discussion, there were cases that spread through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and late-night conversations almost like urban legends. Stories people repeated because they sounded too strange to be real. And among the strangest of all was something that happened on a quiet hill outside Rio de Janeiro. Even today, decades later, the lead mass case remains one of the most bizarre unsolved deaths in modern history. Not because of violence, not because of gore, but because every detail surrounding the case feels wrong in a way that is difficult to explain. Two men were found dead on a hillside, both dressed formally in suits, both wearing homemade lead masks over their eyes. No signs of struggle, no visible injuries, no evidence of robbery. And beside them, investigators found a handwritten note containing instructions so cryptic that people still argue about their meaning today. 16. 30B at specified location. 1830 ingest capsules. After effect protect metals await signal mask. That was it. No explanation. No names mentioned. No indication of who the signal was meant to come from or why the men were waiting for it. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the story is that these were not drifters, criminals, or mentally unstable outsiders. They were ordinary men, technicians, workers, people with families. People whose lives appeared completely normal until they suddenly walked into one of the strangest mysteries in Brazilian history. The place where their bodies were discovered was called Vintim Hill, located near the city of Niterói across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. During the 1960s, the area already carried strange local rumors. Residents spoke about unexplained lights appearing above the hill at night. Some described glowing objects hovering silently in the sky. Others believed spiritual groups gathered there secretly after dark. Brazil during that era was deeply shaped by spiritualism, mysticism, and fascination with paranormal phenomena. Seances, psychic experimentation, UFO sightings, occult groups, and attempts to contact higher intelligences were not fringe interests hidden away from society. They existed openly in parts of Brazilian culture, especially among circles interested in spiritism and scientific mysticism. And this matters, because the lead mass case does not make sense unless you understand the atmosphere surrounding the country at that time. This was an era where educated people genuinely believe human beings might soon communicate with extraterrestrial intelligences. Newspapers discussed UFO sightings seriously. Paranormal investigators became public figures. Spiritualist movements blended science, religion, electronics, and mysticism together into entirely new belief systems. And somewhere inside that strange cultural atmosphere, two men named Miguel Jose Vianney and Manuel Pereira de Cruz became involved in something that would eventually lead them onto that hill and leave them there forever. Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz were electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, a city north of Rio de Janeiro. At first glance, there was nothing extraordinary about them. They were skilled working-class men with technical backgrounds, employed in radio and television repair work. Intelligent enough to understand electronics and circuitry, disciplined enough to maintain stable employment, ordinary enough that nobody around them initially imagined they could become central figures in one of Brazil's strangest unsolved mysteries. Miguel was older, more reserved according to people who knew him. Manuel was younger and generally considered more outgoing. Both were married. Both had families. Neither had criminal histories. Neither appeared connected to organized crime or extremist movements. But there was another side to their lives. Outside ordinary work, the two men had become deeply interested in spiritual experimentation. Not religion in the traditional sense, something stranger. Throughout Brazil during the 1960s, small groups emerged blending spiritualism with electronics, scientific language, psychic communication, and paranormal experimentation. Some believe human consciousness could interact with higher dimensions through electrical frequencies. Others believed extraterrestrial communication was possible through specific mental or technological practices. Miguel and Manuel reportedly became involved in circles interested in these ideas. And over time, they grew increasingly fascinated with attempts to contact non-human intelligences. This sounds absurd to modern audiences at first, but during the mid-20th century, interest in UFOs and paranormal science exploded internationally. The space race was transforming public imagination. Human beings were preparing to walk on the moon. Nuclear technology had changed civilization permanently. Suddenly, the impossible no longer felt impossible. And in places like Brazil, where spiritualist traditions already existed strongly within the culture, UFO fascination often merged naturally with mysticism. People began believing extraterrestrials might communicate through consciousness itself, or through frequencies, or through altered states of perception. And according to later reports, Miguel and Manuel became increasingly obsessed with these possibilities. Some acquaintances later claimed the men had participated in amateur scientific spiritual experiments before. There were stories involving psychedelic substances, attempts at psychic communication, and experiments combining electronics with spiritual practices. And although many of these accounts remain difficult to verify fully, they became central to understanding the final days before the lead mass case unfolded. Because whatever happened on Ventum Hill almost certainly did not begin there. It began long before the men ever climbed that slope. On August 17, 1966, Miguel and Manuel left Campos dos Goitacazes together. Before leaving, Manuel reportedly told his wife he needed to travel for work-related business involving electronics equipment. Nothing about his behavior appeared unusual enough to alarm family members significantly. The men dressed normally and carried money with them before beginning the journey toward Niterói. And this detail would later become important. Because despite all the mystery surrounding the case, the men did not appear frightened beforehand. They appeared purposeful, like they were following a plan. At some point during the journey, the two men stopped to purchase raincoats despite the weather reportedly being warm that day. Witnesses later remembered this because the purchase seemed strange given the heat. Why would two men buy heavy raincoats during warm weather before climbing a hill? Nobody knows. But the raincoats would later become one of the most recognizable details of the entire case because both men were found dead still wearing them. Later, the men also purchased a bottle of water at a local shop near Ventum Hill. According to one witness, they seemed nervous but controlled. One of the men reportedly checked his watch repeatedly while speaking very little. Again, nothing outwardly dramatic. No panic or visible intoxication. No signs they believed they were walking toward death. Eventually, they reached Ventum Hill. The hill itself overlooked parts of the surrounding city while remaining isolated enough that people could gather there privately away from public attention. Vegetation covered large sections of the slope, while exposed rocky areas opened toward the skyline beyond. And according to local rumors, strange lights had reportedly been seen above that hill for years. Some residents claimed glowing objects appeared there regularly at night. Others dismissed the stories completely. But after the lead mass case became public, those rumors exploded across Brazilian media permanently, because 2 days later, the bodies were discovered there. The bodies of Miguel Jose Vianney and Manuel Pereira de Cruz were discovered by a local boy flying a kite near Vintum Hill. At first glance, the scene looked surreal. The two men lay side by side on the hillside wearing formal suits beneath waterproof raincoats. Neither body showed obvious signs of violence. There were no gunshot wounds, stab wounds, or visible trauma suggesting physical struggle. But what immediately drew attention were the masks. Each man wore a homemade lead mask covering the eyes. The masks looked crude and unfinished, shaped almost like protective visors cut by hand from sheets of metal. They resembled something between industrial equipment and science fiction props. And beside the bodies, investigators discovered a small notebook containing the now famous instructions. 1630B at specified location. 1830 ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals await signal mask. Those words transformed an already strange death scene into something almost incomprehensible. What capsules? What signal? What effect? Why protect metals? And what exactly were the masks supposed to protect them from? The investigators arriving at the scene quickly realized they were dealing with something unlike any ordinary criminal case. There were no signs of robbery. Money remained with the bodies. Expensive watches remained untouched. The terrain surrounding the hill showed no obvious evidence of violent confrontation. And the positioning of the bodies created another unsettling detail. The men appeared calm, not twisted violently in pain, not collapsed mid-struggle. They looked almost as though they had laid down voluntarily waiting for something. That image would later become iconic within Brazilian popular culture. Two men lying side by side beneath raincoats on a hill overlooking the city, metal masks covering their eyes, while an impossible note sat beside them. It felt less like reality and more like the beginning of a science fiction horror film. And once newspapers published photographs and details from the scene, the entire country became obsessed with the mystery. As news of the lead mask case spread across Brazil, investigators hoped the autopsies would finally bring clarity to what had happened on Vintum Hill. Strange scenes can sometimes become ordinary once forensic evidence enters the picture. Poisoning leaves traces. Violence leaves marks. Drugs alter tissue. Even bizarre deaths usually become more understandable once the bodies are examined scientifically. But the lead mask case refused to become simpler. In fact, the autopsies only deepened the mystery. The bodies of Miguel Jose Vianney and Manuel Pereira de Cruz had already been exposed to the humid Brazilian environment for an extended period by the time they were discovered. The heat, moisture, insects, and natural decomposition complicated the examination significantly. This detail would later become critically important because it limited what investigators could determine with certainty. And perhaps the single greatest investigative failure in the entire case happened almost immediately afterward. Authorities never performed a proper toxicological analysis. No comprehensive testing for poisons. No definitive chemical screening. No advanced laboratory examination capable of identifying what substances may have entered the men's bodies before death. That mistake alone permanently crippled the investigation, because the notes specifically referenced capsules. 1830 ingest capsules. The men were apparently expected to consume something shortly before whatever event they believed would occur. Yet the one investigative procedure most capable of identifying those substances was either overlooked, mishandled, or simply impossible under the forensic limitations of Brazil during the mid-1960s. And once that opportunity disappeared, countless theories became impossible to confirm or disprove permanently. The medical examiners found no obvious signs of physical violence, no stab wounds or bullet wounds, no evidence that the men had been beaten or restrained before death. Their bodies showed none of the injuries typically associated with homicide. This immediately pushed the investigation toward alternative explanations: poisoning, accidental overdose, voluntary ingestion of dangerous substances, some kind of ritualistic experiment gone wrong. But even those explanations created new questions. If the men knowingly consumed something dangerous, why? And why on a remote hill wearing lead masks? The positioning of the bodies continued disturbing investigators as well. The men had not collapsed chaotically across the terrain. They lay beside each other in a way suggesting they had remained calm until close to the moment of death. One body appeared slightly elevated by the slope, while the other rested nearby, almost peacefully beneath the raincoat. There was no sign of desperate movement through the grass. No indication they had tried to flee. No evidence of prolonged suffering visible from the scene itself. That detail became psychologically important to the public because it implied acceptance, as though the men expected whatever happened next. And then there were the masks. Investigators examined them, repeatedly searching for technical explanations. The masks consisted of thick lead sheets, crudely shaped by hand. They covered only the eyes while leaving the rest of the face exposed. No wiring existed. No sophisticated components. Nothing about them resembled advanced scientific equipment, and yet they clearly served a purpose. Nobody carries handmade lead masks accidentally into remote hillsides at night. The question was whether the purpose had been practical, symbolic, or completely irrational. Some investigators theorized the men feared exposure to intense light. Others believed they expected some kind of radiation event connected to UFO sightings or electrical experimentation. A few suspected the masks might have been psychological rather than functional. Ritual objects connected to belief systems instead of real protection. But even that failed to explain why both men died. Because if this was merely spiritual ritual or psychological experimentation, why had neither man survived? The absence of a clear cause of death became devastating for the investigation. Police could not establish murder confidently. They could not establish suicide confidently either. There was no obvious weapon, no clear poison, no sign of outside attack. And slowly, the case began slipping away from normal criminal logic entirely. The investigators were left with fragments. 2 dead technicians, formal suits, raincoats purchased on a warm day, homemade lead masks, cryptic instructions, missing capsules, and no explanation tying any of it together. As journalists descended onto Niterói and newspapers across Brazil began publishing increasingly sensational coverage, the lead mask case transformed from a forensic mystery into something far larger. A national obsession, because people were no longer asking merely how the men died. They were asking what they had been trying to contact in the first place. As the investigation stalled, something else began surfacing repeatedly in conversations with local residents. Lights. Strange lights above the hill. At first, police treated those accounts the same way investigators usually treat rumors surrounding highly publicized cases, cautiously and with skepticism. Once the newspapers began printing words like masks, signals, and capsules, people naturally started attaching their own interpretations to the mystery. That happens in almost every famous unsolved case. Witnesses reinterpret memories. Coincidences suddenly feel important. Stories evolve after public attention transforms ordinary events into mythology. But the problem was that Vintim Hill already had a reputation before the deaths occurred there. For years, locals had spoken about unexplained glowing objects appearing above the hillside at night. Some described bright, circular lights hovering silently before disappearing suddenly into the clouds above Niteroi. Others claimed beams of light had descended toward the hill itself. A few insisted they had seen objects maneuvering in ways ordinary aircraft could not. Most people dismissed these stories completely, but not everyone. Brazil during the 1960s was experiencing an enormous wave of UFO fascination. Reports of unidentified flying objects appeared constantly across newspapers, radio programs, and magazines. Entire organizations formed dedicated to investigating sightings. Pilots, military personnel, fishermen, farmers, and ordinary civilians all reported strange aerial phenomena throughout the country. And unlike in many other parts of the world, Brazilian UFO culture often merged directly with spiritualism. People did not simply believe extraterrestrials might exist somewhere far away in space. Some believed contact was already happening, quietly, through signals, through altered consciousness, through specific locations believed to possess unusual energy. Vintim Hill became one of those locations. After the lead mass case exploded nationally, witnesses began coming forward claiming they had seen unusual lights over the hill on the very night Miguel and Manuel died. One woman described seeing a bright orange object hovering silently above the area before moving rapidly across the sky. Another claimed flashes of blue-white light illuminated the hill sometime during the evening hours. Some accounts sounded sober and restrained. Others sounded almost fantastical. Investigators never confirmed any of them, but the damage was already done. Because once UFOs entered the story publicly, the lead mass case transformed completely in the public imagination. No longer just a mysterious death investigation, it became something darker and far stranger. A possible encounter, an experiment, a failed attempt at communication with something beyond ordinary human understanding. And suddenly, details that previously seemed merely odd began feeling loaded with meaning. The masks covering the eyes, the phrase "await signal," the formal clothing, the exact timing written in the note, even the isolated location itself. Everything now seemed connected to some larger hidden purpose. Newspapers across Brazil leaned heavily into the UFO angle because it sold enormously well. Front pages described the men waiting for contact. Illustrations showed glowing discs descending above the hill while two figures in suits lay beneath them wearing metallic masks. The public became obsessed. And perhaps the reason the story spread so aggressively was because the timing itself amplified its power psychologically. The mid-1960s were an era dominated by technological anxiety and cosmic imagination. Human beings were preparing to reach the moon. Nuclear weapons threatened civilization constantly. Satellites orbited Earth for the first time. The line between science fiction and reality suddenly felt thinner than ever before. People genuinely believed humanity stood on the edge of discovering something enormous, something world-changing. And a lead mass case seemed to emerge directly from that atmosphere. Two electronics technicians climb a hill outside Rio carrying mysterious instructions, consume unknown capsules, place lead masks over their eyes, and die waiting for a signal from the sky. It sounded impossible, but it also sounded exactly like the kind of story people desperately wanted to believe might be true. And that combination made the case immortal. Yet beneath all the sensationalism, investigators still faced the same impossible problem. No matter how strange the theories became, they still lacked the one thing every real investigation needs: evidence. No spacecraft landed on the hill. No radiation signatures were discovered. No advanced technology was recovered. No hidden transmitter existed nearby. Only 2 dead men and a mystery large enough for an entire country to project its fears, fantasies, and obsessions onto. Still, as police dug deeper into the backgrounds of Miguel and Manuel, they discovered something that complicated the story even further. This was not the first time these men, or people connected to them, had become involved in bizarre experiments involving masks, lights, and unexplained phenomena. As police continued reconstructing the final movements of Miguel Jose Vianu and Manuel Pereira de Cruz, investigators discovered that the lead mask case did not emerge from nowhere. There had been another incident, another experiment, another man connected to the same strange world of electronics, spiritualism, and attempted contact with unknown forces. And once that earlier event surfaced publicly, the case became even more disturbing. According to reports uncovered during the investigation, Miguel and Manuel were connected to a small circle of amateur scientific spiritualists who conducted bizarre experiments involving electronic devices, psychedelic substances, homemade equipment, and attempts to communicate with what they believed were higher intelligences. These were not traditional occultists in black robes performing ancient rituals. That is what made the story feel so strange. They approached the supernatural almost like engineers. They spoke in technical language. Frequencies, signals, radiation, energy, vibrations, mental states. They believed technology and consciousness could interact in ways mainstream science had not yet discovered. In years before the deaths on Vinton Hill, one experiment connected to this group had already ended in disaster. A man named Herminio Wernick, reportedly associated with similar spiritual electronic circles, had died under bizarre circumstances after an explosion caused by one of these amateur experiments. Details surrounding the incident remained fragmented and inconsistent depending on the source, but the core story remained the same. Members of these groups were engaging in dangerous attempts to contact or perceive something beyond ordinary human reality. That revelation changed how investigators viewed the lead mask case, because suddenly the cryptic note no longer looked completely random, nor did the masks, nor the capsules. The deaths now appeared connected to a larger pattern of behavior, one involving educated men willingly participating in increasingly dangerous experiments blending pseudoscience, mysticism, and technological obsession together into something unstable. And this raised another deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if Miguel and Manuel fully intended to place themselves in altered states of consciousness that night on the hill? What if the capsules were not poison in the traditional sense, but hallucinogens or experimental substances meant to help them receive something? This theory gained traction quickly because it explained several details simultaneously. The note, the timing, the deliberate journey to the hill, the waiting for a signal. The lead masks possibly intended to shield the eyes from bright flashes or radiation. And perhaps most importantly, the calmness of the scene itself. The men did not appear kidnapped or attacked. Everything suggested participation, cooperation, intentional preparation, almost like two people conducting an experiment they believed would work. But if that were true, then what went wrong? That question became central to the mystery. Because if the men voluntarily consumed substances expecting some kind of transcendent experience, why did both die? One possibility was overdose. Another was accidental poisoning from improperly prepared chemicals. Some investigators suggested the men may have ingested powerful psychedelic compounds while already physically stressed from heat, dehydration, and emotional intensity. Others theorized they accidentally poisoned themselves through amateur chemical experimentation involving electronics or radiation. But again, the same obstacle remained. No confirmed chemical evidence. No surviving capsules. The most important physical clues in the entire case had vanished forever. And without them, speculation multiplied uncontrollably. Some theories became increasingly extreme. Certain UFO enthusiasts argued the men had genuinely expected extraterrestrial contact and died from exposure to some unknown force associated with the phenomenon they attempted to summon. Others believed the men were victims of fraud, manipulated by charismatic spiritual leaders into dangerous rituals involving drugs and psychological conditioning. There were even suggestions that the entire case may have involved criminal deception linked to smuggling or black market electronics operations disguised beneath spiritualist language. But every theory eventually collided with the same frustrating reality. Nothing fully explained all the details at once, because the lead mass case possesses a quality shared by only the most enduring mysteries. Every explanation feels close to correct, but never completely correct. And the deeper journalists dug into the strange world surrounding Miguel and Manuel, the more surreal the story became. Investigators discovered that the men had reportedly experimented previously with homemade electronic devices intended to contact spirits or extraterrestrial entities. Some accounts described improvised radios, unusual light experiments, and attempts to channel communication through specific frequencies or electrical signals. Again, to modern audiences, this can sound absurd. But during the 1960s, these ideas existed inside a strange intersection between optimism and paranoia. Technology felt magical to many people. Radio waves themselves were invisible forces carrying voices across enormous distances. Television signals moved through the air. Satellites orbited overhead. Nuclear energy had unlocked terrifying new possibilities. To certain minds, it no longer seemed impossible that hidden intelligences might communicate through frequencies ordinary people simply did not yet understand. Miguel and Manuel appeared to believe something was waiting beyond ordinary perception. And on that hill overlooking Niterói, they may have believed they were about to finally reach it. The capsules became one of the most important missing pieces in the entire investigation because they represented the final known action Miguel and Manuel were supposed to perform before whatever happened on Venom Hill. 1830 ingest capsules. The note was specific, timed, procedural, almost clinical in the way it described the sequence of events. The men were expected to arrive at the location, consume the capsules, protect themselves with the masks, and then await some kind of signal. That wording implied anticipation, expectation, preparation for an event they believed would happen with certainty. And yet when investigators searched the hill, no capsules were ever recovered. This detail became enormously significant because it suggested one of several possibilities, none of them comforting. Either the men consumed every capsule completely and left nothing behind, someone else removed evidence from the scene afterward, or the capsules themselves never existed physically in the way investigators imagined. Police initially leaned toward poisoning. It was the simplest explanation available. Two men voluntarily ingest unknown substances and die shortly afterward. Case closed. But once again, the details resisted simplicity. If the capsules were poison, why write instructions down at all? Why travel carefully to the hill? Why wear suits? Why wait for a signal? Why create lead masks specifically shielding the eyes? The entire sequence felt ceremonial rather than suicidal. And according to people who knew the men, neither Miguel nor Manuel displayed obvious signs of depression or suicidal thinking beforehand. They made future plans. They maintained ordinary routines. They traveled openly instead of secretly disappearing. Everything suggested they expected to survive whatever experiment they were conducting. Which raised another possibility. What if the capsules were intended not to kill them, but to alter perception? This theory became increasingly popular as journalists uncovered more information about the spiritualist electronic circles the men were connected to. Psychedelics and altered states of consciousness were already becoming associated worldwide with attempts to reach higher awareness during the 1960s. Across different countries, intellectuals, mystics, scientists, and fringe researchers experimented with substances they believed could expand human consciousness beyond ordinary limits. And in Brazil, where spiritualism already blended naturally with paranormal beliefs, those ideas found fertile ground. Some investigators theorized the capsules may have contained hallucinogens or stimulants intended to heighten perception before the expected signal arrived. Under that interpretation, the masks themselves might have been intended to protect the men from bright flashes or overwhelming visual effects during the experience. Others believe the capsules may have been chemically unstable amateur compounds created by the group itself. Electronics technicians experimenting recklessly with homemade substances, radiation theories, spiritual practices, and altered states. That possibility frightened investigators because it meant that deaths may not have resulted from external forces at all, but from intelligent men pushing themselves too far into dangerous pseudoscientific experimentation. Still, critics pointed out another inconsistency. If the men accidentally poisoned themselves through experimentation, why did they die so peacefully? There was no evidence of violent convulsions at the scene, no signs of desperate movement through the grass, no clawing at the ground, nothing suggesting two men suffered catastrophic physical distress simultaneously before death. The bodies looked strangely composed, as though the men simply laid down waiting for something that never came. And that detail haunted people, because psychologically, the lead mask case feels less like an accident and more like interrupted anticipation. Almost as if Miguel and Manuel believed they stood on the edge of witnessing something extraordinary. The hill itself amplified that atmosphere enormously. Vintim Hill overlooked parts of the glowing city beneath it, while remaining isolated enough that the darkness swallowed sound quickly after sunset. In 1960s Brazil, before modern urban expansion transformed the region completely, the hillside at night would have felt far more remote than it does today. Imagine it carefully. Warm, humid air moving through the vegetation. Distant city lights flickering below the slope. The sound of insects and wind mixing together in the darkness while two men in formal suits stand waiting beneath the night sky beside improvised scientific equipment and handwritten instructions. Then the capsules. Then the masks. Then silence. That image became almost impossible for the Brazilian public to forget. And because no definitive forensic evidence survived to explain the deaths scientifically, imagination filled the empty space where certainty should have existed. Theories multiplied across newspapers, radio programs, and eventually television discussions. Some believed the men accidentally overdosed during mystical experimentation. Others believed they successfully contacted something and paid the price. And a smaller but extremely vocal group insisted the lead mass case represented genuine extraterrestrial contact gone catastrophically wrong. Because according to some witnesses, the strange lights above Vintam Hill did not stop after the deaths. In fact, for certain people, they became even more frequent afterward. As the investigation stalled, the lead mass case escaped the control of police entirely and entered something far more powerful: the imagination of the Brazilian public. By the late 1960s, newspapers across the country were publishing new theories almost daily. Some front pages treated the case like a criminal mystery. Others leaned fully into the paranormal angle, printing dramatic illustrations of glowing UFOs hovering above Vintam Hill while two shadowy figures in suits stared upward through metallic masks. And the public could not look away, because the imagery itself was unforgettable. Two dead technicians lying side by side on a hillside overlooking Rio de Janeiro. Formal suits, raincoats, handmade lead masks covering their eyes. A cryptic note speaking about capsules and signals. Strange lights reported in the sky. It felt cinematic before cinema had even transformed it into mythology. Radio programs invited spiritualists, UFO researchers, scientists, priests, and self-proclaimed paranormal investigators to debate the meaning of the case live on air. Some argued the men had attempted conscious communication with extraterrestrial intelligences. Others believed they had accidentally poisoned themselves during amateur psychic experiments. More conservative voices dismissed the entire thing as mass hysteria mixed with pseudoscience. But even skeptics admitted one uncomfortable fact: the case was genuinely strange, not because of supernatural evidence, but because human behavior itself seemed so difficult to explain rationally. People kept returning to the same question: why would two apparently intelligent men willingly place lead masks over their eyes on a remote hill while waiting for a signal? The masks became iconic almost immediately. Newspapers printed close-up photographs of the crude lead visors repeatedly. Readers stared at them, tried to understand their purpose. They looked absurd and frightening at the same time. Primitive, homemade, yet somehow deeply unsettling. The masks resembled objects from a world slightly adjacent to ordinary reality. Not advanced enough to feel futuristic. Not normal enough to feel harmless. And psychologically, that detail mattered enormously. Because the lead mask case emerged during a historical moment where humanity itself felt caught between old belief systems and terrifying new technological possibilities. The space race was accelerating. Nuclear anxiety shaped global politics constantly. Reports of UFO sightings exploded internationally. Technology increasingly felt magical to ordinary people. The future no longer seemed predictable, and the lead mask case captured that uncertainty perfectly. The story blended modernity with mysticism in a way that felt uniquely disturbing. These were not medieval occultists performing ancient rituals in hidden forests. They were electronics technicians, working men connected to radios, circuitry, and electrical systems. Their mystery belonged to the modern world. That made the case feel possible, perhaps even more unsettlingly relatable, because many people recognized aspects of themselves inside Miguel and Manuel. Curiosity, fascination with hidden knowledge, Belief that reality contains layers not yet fully understood. The difference was that most people stopped before climbing a hill at night, wearing homemade lead masks waiting for a signal from the sky. But Miguel and Manuel apparently did not stop. And once the story spread internationally, foreign UFO researchers became obsessed with the case as well. Articles about the lead mask mystery appeared in paranormal magazines across Europe and North America. The deaths became linked to broader discussions about contact phenomena, consciousness experimentation, and alleged government secrecy surrounding extraterrestrial encounters. Some writers even compared the case to early Cold War psychological experiments. They speculated the man may have unknowingly participated in some form of but the absence of clear evidence became part of the mystery itself. Because unlike ordinary criminal investigations, the lead mask case contained enormous empty spaces where answers should have existed. No confirmed cause of death, no surviving experiment notes, no identified leader organizing the ritual, no explanation for the masks, no explanation for the signal. The entire case felt like investigators had arrived halfway through a story whose beginning and ending had both disappeared. Among all the theories surrounding the case, the idea of attempted contact remained the most persistent. According to this interpretation, Miguel Jose Vianney and Manuel Pereira de Cruz believed they were participating in a controlled encounter with a non-human intelligence. Not necessarily aliens in the simplistic science fiction sense, but some form of higher presence accessed through altered consciousness, electromagnetic frequencies, spiritual rituals, or combinations of all three. That distinction matters because Brazilian spiritualist culture during the 1960s often blurred the line between extraterrestrials, spirits, advanced beings, and higher dimensions. These concepts frequently merged together into the same broader worldview. To many believers, contact did not simply mean seeing a spacecraft physically land. It meant communication, transmission, receiving knowledge, expanding perception beyond ordinary human limits. And under this framework, the lead mask case began looking less like random tragedy and more like a ritualized attempt to pierce through reality itself. The note supports that interpretation disturbingly well. Be it specified location, ingest capsules, awaits signal. It reads almost like preparation for initiation into an experience expected to arrive externally. Not passive meditation, not casual experimentation, something anticipated with precision and structure. Even the lead masks took on symbolic meaning within these theories. Some believe they were intended to shield the eyes from overwhelming light emitted during contact. Others argued the masks protected against radiation from spacecraft or electromagnetic exposure. More esoteric interpretations suggested the masks symbolized blindness to ordinary reality before entering a higher state of awareness. Again, none of this was supported by concrete evidence, but the lack of evidence became strangely irrelevant to many people. Because emotionally, the theory fit the atmosphere of the case almost too perfectly. And there was another reason the public gravitated toward these ideas so intensely. The men themselves looked credible. Miguel and Manuel were technicians. They worked with electronics professionally. They were not portrayed publicly as unstable fanatics disconnected from reality. Their backgrounds gave the mystery a strange layer of legitimacy. If two educated technical workers believed they were conducting a meaningful experiment, perhaps there was more behind it than ordinary superstition. This became especially important during the late 1960s in early 1970s when public fascination with UFOs reached extraordinary levels internationally. Reports flooded newspapers constantly. Governments investigated sightings secretly and publicly. Pilots described impossible aerial maneuvers. Military personnel reported unidentified objects appearing on radar systems. And within that global atmosphere, the lead mass case felt uniquely believable to certain audiences. Not because people necessarily thought extraterrestrials had killed the men directly, but because the deaths resembled what people imagined a failed contact experiment might look like. Preparation, expectation, ritual, signal, death. The structure itself felt mythological, and the Brazilian media understood this immediately. Television programs recreated the final hours dramatically for audiences. Artists painted scenes of glowing objects descending over Vintim Hill while the two technicians stood beneath them wearing reflective metallic masks. Paranormal magazines published diagrams attempting to decode the note mathematically. Some researchers claim the times written in the instructions corresponded to astronomical alignments or electromagnetic cycles. Most of it bordered on fantasy, but that fantasy became inseparable from the case itself. Because unlike many mysteries where evidence eventually destroys speculation, the lead mass case never produced enough definitive answers to eliminate imagination completely. Instead, the mystery remained permanently suspended between rational explanation and something stranger. And perhaps that ambiguity is exactly why the story survived. Because certainty kills mythology. Uncertainty feeds it. The more incomplete the lead mass case remained, the more powerful it became culturally. Even skeptics found themselves disturbed by the emotional texture of the story. There is something deeply eerie about two men calmly preparing themselves for an event nobody else understands. The careful timing, the formal clothing, the apparent seriousness of the ritual. None of it resembles ordinary criminal behavior. It resembles anticipation, and that emotional tone changes everything. Because most unsolved cases revolve around fear. The lead mass case revolved around expectation. Miguel and Manuel did not appear to be hiding from something. They appeared to be waiting for something. And whatever they believed was coming that night on Vintim Hill, they believed it strongly enough to die preparing for it. As the years passed and the lead mass case evolved into near mythology within Brazil, some investigators and researchers attempted to pull the story back towards something more grounded. Not because the case stopped being strange, but because mystery itself has a tendency to grow larger than reality over time. And rationally speaking, there were explanations that could account for at least parts of what happened on Vintim Hill. The most common theory was accidental poisoning during a spiritual or scientific experiment gone wrong. Under this interpretation, Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz were not victims of aliens, government conspiracies, or supernatural forces. They were intelligent but reckless men deeply involved in fringe spiritual electronic practices who accidentally killed themselves through substances they did not fully understand. This theory explains several major details simultaneously. The note becomes experimental instructions. The capsules become hallucinogens, stimulants, or toxic chemical compounds. The masks become protective equipment intended to shield against bright flashes or imagined radiation. And the isolated hill becomes a chosen ritual location where the men expected uninterrupted conditions for their experiment. Psychologically, this explanation makes sense because it aligns closely with the culture surrounding them. During the 1960s, Many educated people experimented with altered states of consciousness, believing they could access hidden truths about reality. Psychedelics, meditation, sensory experimentation, and paranormal research often overlapped within the same communities. Miguel and Manuel may simply have gone too far. Perhaps they consumed dangerous substances, expecting transcendence, and instead suffered fatal reactions. Some investigators believe the men may have ingested capsules containing toxic compounds mixed incorrectly by amateur experimenters. Others suggested overdose combined with heat exhaustion and stress. A few theorized accidental cardiac arrest triggered by stimulants or hallucinogens. And if proper toxicology had been performed immediately after the bodies were discovered, the mystery might have ended there. But it never was. That failure permanently poisoned the investigation because it allowed uncertainty to survive indefinitely. Without toxicological evidence, every theory remained incomplete. Still, even rational investigators struggled with certain emotional aspects of the case. Because although accidental poisoning explains the deaths themselves reasonably well, it does not fully explain the atmosphere surrounding the event. The waiting, the anticipation, the strange calmness of the scene. Everything about the lead mass case feels ceremonial rather than accidental. And perhaps that is why the mystery survived culturally long after many stranger cases were forgotten. Another rational explanation suggested the men were victims of fraud or manipulation. According to this theory, someone within the spiritualist circles surrounding Miguel and Manuel convinced them they could experience contact with higher beings or receive supernatural knowledge through a carefully staged ritual involving capsules and sensory isolation. The men trusted the process completely and voluntarily participated, unaware the substances or methods involved were dangerous. Under this interpretation, the lead mass case becomes less about paranormal mystery and more about belief itself. Two intelligent men placing enormous faith in ideas that ultimately destroyed them. And historically, that explanation is disturbingly plausible. Human beings throughout history have willingly entered dangerous rituals believing they were approaching enlightenment, revelation, salvation, or transcendence. Sometimes those rituals involved religion, sometimes ideology, sometimes pseudoscience, sometimes charismatic leaders convincing followers they possessed secret knowledge hidden from ordinary society. The lead mass case fits uncomfortably well into that broader human pattern. But once again, no evidence ever identified a clear organizer behind the event. No cult leader emerged publicly. No hidden network was uncovered directing experiments from the shadows. The deeper investigators searched, the more the mystery dissolved into fragments rather than solutions. And so, slowly, the case became trapped permanently between explanation and mythology. Too strange to feel ordinary, too incomplete to feel supernatural. And over time, another fascinating transformation began occurring. The lead mass case stopped belonging solely to investigators. It began belonging to culture itself. Writers referenced it. Television dramatized it. UFO researchers treated it almost like sacred history. And younger generations, discovering the story decades later, often reacted the exact same way people had reacted in 1966. First confusion, then fascination, then obsession with the details. People stare at the photographs for long periods, trying to understand what they are seeing. The masks especially continue producing an almost irrational emotional reaction. There is something profoundly disturbing about them despite their simplicity. Perhaps because they imply preparation. The men expected to need them. And expectation changes the emotional meaning of everything surrounding the case. Miguel and Manuel did not appear afraid when they climbed Vintim Hill. They appeared ready. That distinction is what transformed the lead mask case from ordinary tragedy into enduring mythology. Today, Vintim Hill does not look like the kind of place where one of the world's strangest mysteries should have happened. That may be one of the most unsettling parts of the entire story. The hill sits near urban life. Roads exist nearby. Buildings spread across the surrounding areas. The lights of Rio de Janeiro shimmer across the bay after sunset, while traffic noise drifts faintly through the humid night air. During daylight, parts of the area appear almost ordinary, and yet the atmosphere changes once darkness arrives, especially if you know the story, because mysteries alter locations permanently. Human imagination leaves marks on places even when physical evidence disappears long ago. People still climb Vintim Hill searching for something. Some go out of curiosity. Some are UFO enthusiasts hoping to witness strange aerial phenomena for themselves. Others simply want to stand where Miguel Jose Vianney and Manuel Pereira de Cruz spent their final hours beneath the Brazilian night sky, waiting for a signal nobody else understood. And according to certain locals, the lights never completely stopped. Stories still circulate quietly about glowing objects appearing above the hill after dark. Most are probably misidentified aircraft, atmospheric effects, drones, or exaggerations shaped by decades of mythology surrounding the area. But that almost no longer matters. Because once a place becomes associated with mystery deeply enough, every strange shadow and distant light begins feeding the story automatically. And the lead mask case feeds itself extremely well. The imagery is simply too powerful. Two technicians in formal clothing climbing a hill carrying homemade lead masks and cryptic instructions before dying under circumstances no one fully explains. The scene feels almost artificially constructed for human fascination, like something generated by collective unconscious fears about technology, hidden knowledge, and contact with forces beyond ordinary understanding. Over time, the case stopped existing purely as an event for 1966. It became symbolic. The masks themselves especially transformed into icons of modern mystery culture. They appear constantly in documentaries, paranormal books, conspiracy forums, YouTube videos, podcasts, and internet discussions. Artists recreate them repeatedly because they trigger immediate emotional curiosity. Their design is primitive and crude, yet psychologically disturbing in ways difficult to explain. Perhaps because they represent preparation for something unseen. The men believed they needed protection from an event that had not happened yet. That single detail contains enormous emotional power. And unlike many mysteries where later discoveries weaken the atmosphere surrounding the story, time actually strengthened the lead mask case. The lack of resolution allowed imagination to continue expanding indefinitely. Every generation encountering the mystery adds new fears and interpretations onto it. During the Cold War years, people connected the deaths to secret government experiments and radiation paranoia. Later generations focused more heavily on UFO theories and extraterrestrial contact. Modern internet culture often interprets the story psychologically, viewing Miguel and Manuel as examples of intelligent people consumed by obsession, pseudoscience, and a dangerous pursuit of hidden truths. And perhaps all of those interpretations contain fragments of reality, because one reason the lead mask case remains compelling is that it reflects multiple human fears simultaneously. Fear of the unknown, fear of hidden knowledge, fear of technology advancing faster than wisdom, fear of manipulation, fear of obsession, fear that reality itself may contain things human beings are not emotionally prepared to encounter. But perhaps the deepest fear inside the story is simpler than all of that. The fear of expectation. Miguel and Manuel climbed that hill believing something would happen. That detail remains terrifying because human beings instinctively understand what anticipation feels like. Waiting for revelation, waiting for transformation, waiting for contact, waiting for proof that reality contains more than ordinary life suggests. And whatever the two men expected to experience on Vindham Hill, they believed in it enough to organize their final evening around precise instructions and ritual preparation. That level of belief changes the emotional texture of the entire mystery, because the lead mask case was not driven primarily by fear. It was driven by hope. Hope that something extraordinary was about to occur. And perhaps that is why the story continues haunting people decades later. Because in the end, nobody knows what Miguel and Manuel actually saw that night. Maybe nothing. Maybe hallucinations created by chemicals and expectation. Maybe the final moments of two intelligent men trapped inside dangerous pseudoscientific obsession. Or maybe something else entirely. Something impossible to verify because the only two people who truly understood the purpose of the mass died on that hillside with the answer still inside their heads. And so the lead mass case remains suspended permanently between worlds, between science and mysticism, between fraud and belief, between rational explanation and cosmic horror, between reality and mythology. And perhaps that is exactly where it will remain forever. There is one final reason the lead mask case continues surviving while so many other unsolved mysteries slowly fade away. The story never truly ends. Even after all the theories, all the documentaries, all the newspaper articles, all the debates between skeptics and believers, there remains a strange feeling that investigators only encountered the outer shell of something much larger. Because when you strip away the UFO mythology, the paranormal speculation, and the sensational media coverage, one deeply unsettling fact still remains. Two intelligent men deliberately organized an event on a remote Brazilian hill using written instructions, unknown capsules, handmade lead masks, and precise timing. That happened, and nobody ever discovered why. That absence of motive is what keeps the case alive psychologically. Most mysteries become less frightening once motive appears. Even horrifying crimes become emotionally manageable once people understand what drove them. Greed, revenge, fear, jealousy, ideology. Human beings are comforted by motive because motive restores order. But the lead mask case never restored order. There was no clear gain, no obvious enemy, no visible conflict, only expectation. And perhaps that is what makes the story feel so uniquely modern. Miguel and Manuel did not appear to be running from something. They appear to be searching for something. That distinction changes everything. The hill was not chosen randomly. The notes suggest preparation extending well before the final evening. The masks had been manufactured intentionally beforehand. The timing mattered. The capsules mattered. The signal mattered. Every detail points toward anticipation of an event the men believed was real. And psychologically, that creates a terrifying possibility. What if the most dangerous human impulse is not fear, but curiosity? History is filled with people destroying themselves, searching for hidden truths. alchemists poisoning themselves with experimental compounds, mystics starving themselves, chasing revelation, scientists exposing themselves to dangerous radiation before fully understanding its effects, cult members surrendering reason in pursuit of transcendence. The lead mask case belongs somewhere inside that long human tradition. Two men convinced reality contains something waiting just beyond ordinary perception, something reachable, something worth preparing for. And perhaps that is why the story still feels emotionally unresolved even after nearly 60 years. Because the mystery touches a deeper human instinct most people recognize inside themselves. The desire to know more than we are supposed to know, to see what exists behind the curtain, to receive the signal. That emotional core survives regardless of whether the final explanation was mundane or extraordinary. Maybe Miguel and Manuel simply overdosed accidentally during amateur psychedelic experimentation. Maybe they were manipulated by spiritual fraudsters promising cosmic contact. Maybe the masks were symbolic nonsense created by men consumed by pseudoscientific obsession. Rationally, those explanations are probably the most likely. But emotionally, the case refuses to stay fully rational, because the atmosphere surrounding it feels wrong in ways difficult to explain logically. The tropical Brazilian night, the humid darkness above the city, the handwritten instructions, the careful timing, the masks waiting beside the capsules, the two men lying motionless on the hill as though the experiment had reached its final stage. It all feels suspended halfway between science fiction and reality. And perhaps the strangest part is this. If the lead mask case happened today, the internet would likely make it even larger. Modern conspiracy culture would explode around it instantly. Social media would flood with theories within hours. AI-enhanced analysis videos would dissect every word of the note frame by frame. UFO communities, true crime channels, psychologists, chemists, spiritual influencers, skeptics, and conspiracy theorists would all construct entirely different versions of the story simultaneously. But in some ways, the mystery benefited from happening in 1966. Because the lack of digital oversaturation preserved its atmosphere, the story still feels distant, foggy, almost dreamlike, like an artifact from a moment in history when technology itself still felt mysterious enough that people genuinely believed signals from another reality might suddenly arrive through the darkness. And maybe that is why the image survives so powerfully. Not the autopsy reports, not the police files, not the witness statements. The image. Two men in suits wearing lead masks beneath the Brazilian night sky waiting for something unseen. Human beings remember images emotionally long after facts disappear. And the lead mask case may contain one of the most unforgettable images in modern mystery history. Because at its heart, the story represents something larger than two unexplained deaths. It represents the dangerous intersection between belief and technology. The moment where modernity stopped making the world feel safer and instead made it feel stranger. Signals moving invisibly through the air. Voices transmitted across enormous distances. Satellites orbiting above the planet. Nuclear energy unlocking terrifying hidden forces. The realization that reality contained invisible systems ordinary people barely understood. Miguel and Manuel lived inside that moment. And perhaps they pushed themselves too far trying to understand it. Or perhaps they believed they already had. Either way, when investigators climbed Vintim Hill in August of 1966, they did not just find two dead technicians. They found the remains of an idea. The idea that somewhere beyond ordinary human perception, something was waiting to answer back. And even now, decades later, people still wonder the same thing the investigators wondered standing over those bodies for the first time. What signal were they waiting for? One of the strangest aspects of the lead mass case is not simply the mystery itself, but the effect the mystery seemed to have on the people who spent too long thinking about it. Because unlike ordinary criminal investigations where evidence gradually narrows the possibilities, this case had the opposite psychological effect. The longer people examined it, the more uncertain everything became. Journalists became obsessed with details that led nowhere. Researchers spent years trying to decode the note mathematically. UFO investigators revisited Vinton Hill repeatedly, hoping to witness the same lights locals described during the 1960s. Paranormal authors connected the deaths to broader theories involving psychic frequencies, dimensional contact, and electromagnetic experimentation. And over time, the lead mass case developed something almost resembling gravitational pull within Brazilian mystery culture. Once people entered the story deeply enough, they rarely left satisfied, because every explanation eventually collapses somewhere. The rational theories explain the deaths, but not the atmosphere. The paranormal theories explain the atmosphere, but not the evidence. Entrapped between those two extremes sits the uncomfortable possibility that the real truth may be both simpler and stranger than anyone wants to admit. Some investigators later believe the entire mystery became distorted because the public focused too heavily on the bizarre imagery instead of ordinary human behavior. Under that interpretation, Miguel and Manuel were simply intelligent men consumed gradually by pseudoscientific obsession during an era already saturated with spiritual experimentation and UFO hysteria. The masks then become symbols of irrational belief rather than meaningful protection. The note becomes fragmented instructions for a failed chemical or psychological experiment. The hill becomes merely a dramatic setting chosen by coincidence and imagination. That explanation is probably the safest one emotionally, because it keeps the story human, manageable, contained. But even people who accept that interpretation often admit the emotional power of the case still affects them unexpectedly. The photographs especially. Something about seeing the actual mass creates immediate discomfort. They look primitive enough to feel believable, yet strange enough to feel deeply unnatural. They resemble objects made for a purpose that exists slightly outside ordinary reality. And perhaps that discomfort comes from recognizing something dangerous inside the men themselves. Not madness. Curiosity. Miguel and Manuel do not resemble stereotypical cult fanatics or unstable drifters. They resemble ordinary people who slowly drifted too far into ideas they believed would reveal hidden truths. And that possibility frightens people because modern society produces those kinds of obsessions constantly. Human beings remain vulnerable to systems promising secret knowledge hidden beneath ordinary reality. Conspiracy theories, extremist ideologies, pseudoscience movements, cult structures, technological mysticism, all of them feed the same deep psychological impulse. The desire to believe there is more. More hidden beneath the surface. More waiting behind visible reality. More signals humanity has not yet learned to decode. The lead mass case feels timeless because that impulse itself is timeless. And perhaps that is why the mystery continues surviving online decades after the deaths occurred. Every generation rediscovers it and projects its own anxieties onto the story. In the Cold War era, people feared radiation and secret experiments. In later decades, UFO culture transformed the men into possible contactees. Modern internet culture often interprets them as victims of dangerous belief systems amplified by misinformation and obsession. Yet none of those interpretations fully erase the eerie, emotional core of the story. Two men calmly climbed a hill believing something extraordinary was about to happen. That remains true regardless of which theory people choose. And maybe the final tragedy of the lead mass case is that Miguel and Manuel likely died believing they stood on the edge of revelation rather than disaster. There is no evidence they expected death. No evidence they believed they were sacrificing themselves. Everything suggests anticipation instead. Hope, expectation, the belief that the signal would arrive. That emotional detail transforms the entire mystery into something unexpectedly sad beneath all the conspiracy and mythology surrounding it. Because underneath the masks and strange instructions were still two human beings searching for meaning in a rapidly changing world. Searching perhaps for proof that reality contains something greater than ordinary life. And in the end, whatever they thought they were about to encounter on Vintim Hill never became visible to anyone else. Only the mystery survived. The hill remained. The masks remained. The note remained. And over time, the real men themselves slowly disappeared beneath the weight of the mythology surrounding them. Miguel Jose Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz stopped existing primarily as individuals in public memory. They became symbols instead, the men in the lead masks. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to check out this channel for more captivating stories. Until then, farewell.